In input.go, this getUserMetrics function could be split up into a function that fetches the weight input, one function that fetches height input, one function that cleans weight, one function that cleans height, and so on. But splitting this into 6 different functions or more does really not make too much sense to me. Instead, I would say it's quite interesting to think about what this function does in other terms. Instead of thinking about the steps fetching, cleaning, and parsing, we could also think about weight and height. So we could say that cleaning and parsing weight is all one step combined with getting that input in the first place, and the same is true for the height. Now we only have 2 steps here, which we could outsource into separate functions. And if we take a close look at that code here, we have a prime example for creating a function that can be reused. Because in the end, we perform exactly the same operations twice. And having code duplication as we have it here is never a good idea. You always want to avoid it so that you write less code and you have less code that you need to maintain. Therefore, I'll add another function in here in this input.go file, which I will name getUserInput. Now, this function should in the end perform all these steps. So I'll copy that and add that here. But of course, we now need more generic names. Because now, for example, it's not the weight input, it's the user input in general. Because we'll use that same function for getting both the weight and the height. So here I'll not name this weight input, but just user input instead. And of course also here and here and here. And therefore that here is not the weight, but instead just the entered value or anything like that. Whatever name makes sense to you. And that's what I ultimately want to return here, the entered value. Now, of course, here I am always printing that weight prompt though. So that's still weight specific and not very generic. To make it more generic, we could accept this prompt text as a parameter of type string and just output that here. So output this prompt text here with print. Now we get that from outside when that function is called. Then we perform the same steps no matter if it's about the weight or height, which makes sense because we parse the values and clean the values in exactly the same way. And then we return the entered value. And since we return a value, we should also specify the return type here, and that's of course float64. And here I now also should create entered value and add my colon here, therefore, so that this entered value variable is created. Alternatively, of course, we use named return values by wrapping this into parentheses and giving this a name of entered value, or maybe even just value, and then removing the colon here and referring just to value here and remove it here in that return statement line. That will do the same thing. It will parse that float in the end and store it in this value variable, which is declared right at the start, initialized to its null value, which in case of a float is 0.0, and then we'll override it with that parsed float value and return that value ultimately. And now we can use that getUserInput function here instead of having these large code blocks twice. Here we can get rid of that, and instead we just get our weight here by calling getUserInput, and to getUserInput I'll pass info.waitPrompt so that we show the appropriate prompt text. We expect that input parameter here in getUserInput, hence I pass it in. And waitPrompt is a string, this constant string specifically, and hence we fulfill the requirement of passing in a string. Then we get back a float, and since we prompt for the weight first we know that this will be our weight. Well, and then we can just copy that and repeat this for the height and store that value and use the height prompt here. And now we can get rid of that code as well, and then just return those values. And that's now a better approach, I would say, and it's a good example for why we use functions in the first place. If we ever change our parsing or cleaning logic or how we read user input, if we want to react to a different character than the enter key being pressed, we only need to do it once here in this getUserInput function, and it will then change for both places where we call that function. Because here we are using the big advantage of functions, which is that we can call functions multiple times with different inputs and getting back different results. And as a developer, you should always strive for solutions like this, where you have as little code duplication as possible, since that will make your code easier to maintain and it will make it easier for you as a developer to change your code. And that's it for this section. You could definitely come up with more ideas of splitting this up into functions, either splitting it differently or maybe even splitting this into more functions. But you definitely don't want to reach the point where you put every line of code into a separate function. That's not the idea. Nonetheless, you saw some advantages of functions in this section, like here, the removed code duplication. And in general, we now practiced in detail how we can work with functions, with function parameters and return values, including named return values, and how we deal with functions in general. I can only encourage you to play around with that even more, build your own other demo projects, or dive deeper into this project and maybe put some functions into separate packages, or come up with different ways of splitting up those functions. For the moment, we are done with this though, and we're ready to move on and now dive into more exciting Go features. Up to this point in the course, we had a detailed look at a lot of basic concepts. Now we're going to get a bit more advanced, because in this course section, we are going to dive into a concept called pointers. And I'll explain what exactly pointers are and why we have that concept. And I will then also show how we do work with pointers. Because pointers will be very important in later course sections and in even more advanced Go concepts, and therefore it is important to get them out of the way right now and to get a first introduction into this pointers concept.